It's time for the chip race.
For strategy this week, I asked Dara to take a deep dive into probably my most interesting hand from the 2021 WSOP Main Event. It occurred roughly 4 hours into day 4. The money bubble had burst at the very end of day 3, so we were laddering pretty small amounts relatively every 45 minutes or so. Dara, before I get into the specific hand, there is obviously some amount of ICM at play here, but the big points are bubble and late on, especially FT bubble. For practical purposes, then, when people are running spots, as I'm sure a lot of our audience do, does it simplify things to just run the hand with no ICM, interpret the output, and then maybe shave off a hand or two? How do you approach a spot at this point in a tourney?
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable approach with a few caveats. I mean, I have run what I call low ICM spots, where ICM is something of a factor, but it's not massive. And typically that's exactly what happens. Just a few hands get shaved off in different spots. But it's not an across the board equal shave where you just take the worst hand in each category and maybe don't play that. Certain hands realize equity better than others. So some hands are more resilient to staying in the range, even when ICM is a factor. For example, the suited aces. In fact, there are often more suited aces in ICM ranges than in non-ICM ranges. It's typically the unsuited portion of the grid that suffers the most. So with unsuited hands, you have to be very careful because they realize equity poorly in ICM situations, particularly out of position. So it's not unusual to have to shave off 2 or 3 of the worst unsuited aces or unsuited kings, but to actually continue with all of the suited aces or even more of the suited aces. Similarly, other types of hands also lose their value more. You know, a hand like Jack 10 off, for example, loses a lot of its value in the spot, where ICM is a factor because it'll just under-realize post-flop. But the suited hands tend to do okay. So it's often the case you can actually hang on to all your suited connectors. The lower pairs go down in value as well because they won't be able to win as much. One useful heuristic I've kind of spotted is that when you're shallow but ICM is a factor, it often plays more like a deeper stack spot. So 20 big blinds often plays more like 40 big blind ranges, which kind of makes sense because you need more equity to get in post-flop. So therefore, hands which flop equity but not enough to stack off with because of the ICM have to disappear from the range. But other hands which do flop the right kind of equity are better continues.
Yeah, that's a really interesting heuristic and also a great general tip on when you are shaving hands off the range, how maybe shaving much more of the offsuit variety and keeping the suited ones in is the way to change the shape of that range. Okay, to the hand, there were approximately 700 players left in the main event, and I am short with 175k at big blind 10k. I'm in the big blind, so I've just paid the big blind ante. So in reality, my stack is 165k, 16 and a half big blinds. The hijack, someone I had profiled as the laggiest player at the table, opens to 22k. The cutoff calls, I profiled him as a splashy wreck. He was limping into a lot of pots from all positions and generally playing loose passive. The button calls, this guy had a big stack and was new to the table, so I had no real reads there. I defend 6-4 of spades in the big blind. My image was certainly tight aggressive as I had been selectively picking my shove spots with 15 to 25 big blinds for hours. And the only time my hand was actually shown, I had aces in an all-in spot. Given the profiles of the villains and the dynamics and whatnot, before I looked at my hand, I decided, because obviously a lot of money is going in there now, I decided I was squeeze shoving a couple of pips lighter than maybe optimal, maybe GTO, maybe Nash. I would have gone in this spot with any pair, ace 10, ace 9 suited plus, king jack, jack 10 suited, and I think I might have even thrown in a sneaky ace 5 suited as well. How does that sound as an overall game plan? And is my flat with 6-4 suited standard here, Dara?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously a great spot to squeeze. And even if everybody's playing perfectly, you can go super wide. I think the GTO range here is 4s plus ace jack, ace 10 suited, king queen, jack 10 suited, those types of hands. If you think they're going to overfold, you can make the adjustment that you made, which is decide you're going to go even wider. Obviously, the 6-4 suited doesn't come into any reasonable category to do that with, but we're getting an amazing price. So we do want to do a lot of calling as well. This is the right type of hand to call. It's not going to be dominated very much. It can make flushes and straights. And as I said, even though you're relatively shallow here, you do want to be able to make hands that you can happily stack off with. This type of hand will miss the flop a lot, which is fine. Then you just fold and all you've done is lost your big blind. But when it does flop equity, it'll often be the right type of equity and it'll have backdoor equity or very robust equity in a lot of spots. So it seems like a perfect flat, yeah.
Good stuff. Well, so far, so good. To the flop, the pot is 103k and it comes king of hearts, 7 of diamonds, 5 of spades. So I'm sort of wrapped around that 5 of spades. I check. The original raiser bets 33k. The cutoff calls, the button folds, and I call. I really wasn't entirely sure what to do here, I'll be honest. I thought shoving was a decent option, but I also sort of didn't think I had a lot of chips behind, and I thought I could call, and then maybe a semi-bluff on a lot of turns would be a better way to go about it sometimes. Dara, folding was clearly out of the question here. I am open-ended. So which of the lines do you prefer?
This is definitely a spot where you can argue very strongly for either case, purely because it's a tournament. If this is a cash game, I think raising is definitely the best play because our 2 pairs and our stronger King X definitely want to raise. And we have to balance that out then with good semi-bluffs. And this is definitely one of our best semi-bluffs. So it kind of depends on what you were doing with your stronger hands. If you had 2 pair or stronger King X, would you have just called and tried to get them to put more money into the pot? And if you get sucked out on, so be it. Or would you raise and try and deny them equity with those hands? When I looked at this in Snowy, the EV of both options was very, very close. So I think those other factors become the deciding factor. Also, it depends on how they're going to play on later streets as well. You know, again, anytime you look at solver output, you're always assuming that the other player is going to play perfectly on later streets. But sometimes it's correct to take the lower EV option on an earlier street if you think your opponents are going to make mistakes on later streets.
Okay, so I guess I had 2 fairly reasonable options and I took one of them. So no harm done so far. To the turn, the pot is now 202k and it comes the jack of clubs. So the board now reads king of hearts, 7 of diamonds, 5 of spades, jack of clubs. This doesn't feel like the right card for me to semi-bluff at all. So I check and surprisingly, it checks through. What do you think of that decision, Dara?
Yeah, I think that's totally standard. I think you're right. This isn't a good card to bluff on. Checking and hoping that they check behind or at least bet so small that you can realize your equity by calling. That seems a much better plan than just going for it now at this point.
Good stuff. So I still haven't wrecked the hand. Great. To the river, the pot is still 202k. I have 110k in my stack. So the SPOR is just north of 0.5 to 1. And it comes to rather inconsequential 2 of diamonds. So the board now reads king of hearts, 7 of diamonds, 5 of spades, jack of clubs, 2 of diamonds. I thought about it for about 45 seconds or so and decided that I should put my big boy pants on. The turn check through made me feel like it was very possible actually that the original raiser had whiffed and the cutoff had either floated, which was the kind of thing he had been doing to people, or called with a pair between king and 7, which also makes a lot of sense. I felt like given my particularly tight image, I could reasonably represent king queen, king jack, pocket 7s, pocket 5s, definitely some 2-pair combos, although maybe the fact that they perceive me as tight would make them discount 2-pair combos from my range. But, you know, I think I was playing more orthodox and more GTO than they realize. So it's sort of, it cuts both ways there. I do bet the 120k all in and was super happy to get 2 quick folds. But I don't really want to be results oriented, although I was very happy to be results oriented in the moment. Obviously, looking back on the spot now, I want to know if I did the right thing. Clearly, I have one of the worst hands I can get to the river with. So they tend to be decent bluff candidates, but also I have very few chips and I'm laying an amazing price. So when you're laying 25% to 2 villains, it does seem sort of dicey. But, you know, nonetheless, I did decide to go for it. Was I reckless?
I remember you told me this hand at the time, and I had 2 reactions to it. First of all, I thought the river bluff was fine for the reasons you gave. You are at the bottom of your range. And there's some other reasons I'll go into a minute why I think it might be even better in practice than in theory. Secondly, I remember being extremely annoyed at how inordinately proud you were of this hand for what I thought was a fairly routine river bluff. So I was quite surprised to see that on the river, actually, the solver doesn't really go for this. It just checks, but that seems to be just a balance thing. It actually thinks that the shove is break even, which obviously means that it would be fine to shove as well, particularly, and this is probably the key point, if you think the players are going to overfold. Now, there's a couple of things which tournament players do, which suggest that probably the population does overfold in this spot. The first one is that they tend not to check enough strong hands on the turn to protect their checking ranges. If they have a strong hand, they're probably betting again on the turn. So you can kind of cap the range more than should be the case if they were playing theoretically correct because of the turn action. The other thing I think which almost all live players do is they overfold to all ins, irrespective of the size. They don't focus as much on the price that they're getting as just on, well, a guy's gone all in. He's risking his entire tournament life, therefore he must have a hand. They weight you more towards value, I think, when that happens. So actually, I think in practice, this is a very good bluff. And in theory, it's a break-even bluff.
Well, to be honest, I guess I was somewhat proud of myself, and I think you picked up on that, but I think maybe for a slightly different reason. I think that it is the right play, or I did think in the moment that it was the right play, but I was almost proud of myself that I put my tournament life in the main event somewhat deep in the money, all in with 6 high, because I'll be honest with you, even though this is a routine play I would make online in a $50 tournament or whatever I might be playing, and it wouldn't cost me a thought, the gravity of the moment, the gravity of being in the main event, which I guess these kinds of moments in your professional career will sneak up on you once in a while when you are presented with maybe a more important spot or a more lucrative spot. And I felt like it had actually sort of got the tingling sensation going in my body where I kind of thought, oh my God, I'm actually going to put it all in with 6 high. And if some guy just shrug calls here, I'm just going to have to go nice hand 6 high and walk away from the main event. Admittedly, kind of still feeling like I did the right thing, but at the same time, I suppose what I'm trying to say here is I did feel the sweats. So the fact that I still pulled the trigger in what I thought was a close but correct spot, obviously it's turned out to be a correct spot if you add in the caveats you've added and maybe break even if you don't. I suppose I was proud of myself that I did do the right thing under pressure.
Yeah, no, that's a very reasonable point. I was being slightly facetious with the comment. It's definitely to your credit that you were willing to put it all in with 6 high in such a big spot. There are a lot of players who freeze in those spots and they end up just kind of withering out of the tournament, and then they go off and they tell everybody, well, I didn't do anything wrong, I was just card dead, and they don't think back to that spot they could have taken where they could have won a big pot. This is quite an important pot for you, I imagine, given how short you were, and you suddenly won a very big pot with 6 high. That was obviously an amazing result. So yeah, I definitely give you credit for pulling the trigger. I think one of the misconceptions a lot of people have about probably both of us is that we don't really pull the trigger in these spots. But I mean, we do routinely online, and you also have to be able to step back even in the WSOP main event and say, well, this is the play I would do online, so therefore I'm going to do it, irrespective of how big it feels. And it's one of those spots again where, on the one hand, people might say, oh, well, you have to go for these spots. But on the other hand, if you go for this spot and get called, everybody just goes, what were you thinking there, shoving 6 high? That was donkey play.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. It was a crucial moment for me because if I just check, and obviously I'm not going to win a showdown 6 high, I'm left with 11 bigs, which is, going to be a bit of a struggle. Not saying I couldn't spin back, not saying some good stuff couldn't have happened from there. It could, but, I'm pretty much back to the wall now. Whereas by winning this pot, I had 30 big blinds. And now suddenly, even though the blinds, I think, went up pretty quickly soon after, and I was back in the 25 zone, I suddenly had a little bit more wiggle room and actually managed to navigate that sort of 15 to 25 big blind stack all through day 4 and make it into day 5 where it got a bit more interesting again. So I think as well, when you maybe take the view when you are in that zone, in that sort of 20 big zone, for want of a better phrase, and you don't go for the kind of crazy all in, I need to double my stack and have a stack that I can do some bluffing again and do some 3-betting again, like a lot of people think, when you actually take the more balanced approach that I think you and I both take, where we're actually quite comfortable with 15 bigs and 20 bigs and kind of feel like, well, there's still a lot of play in this. I was sort of taking that view, and I guess I never got out of the 25 big zone for any meaningful amount of time during that day of poker. But I was also feeling quite comfortable in that zone. I felt like my decisions would be quite, I don't want to say easy, but maybe they are sort of straightforward, or maybe, I suppose, being a sit and go player originally and a tournament player, they feel very familiar. I don't feel like I'd make too many mistakes in that stack zone.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. As tournament players, we do have to sort of get comfortable with living in that zone. That's where the business end of tournaments is generally decided. Even when we have the big stack, often most of the players at the table will have that sort of 15 to 25 big blinds. So you're playing that game anyway. You don't have a choice. And I think that's something that people sometimes miss. They think, okay, well, I always want to have the big stack, so I can play the big stack game. But if you get 2 tables out and everybody else has 15 to 30 big blinds, it doesn't really matter whether you have 60 or 100. You are playing the 15 to 30 big blind game.
Yeah, well said. Well, Dara, thank you very much for putting this one through the solver under the microscope and just putting your own brain on it as well, because it was a crucial moment for me, maybe one that I felt good about afterwards. And maybe I needed to have more clarification on whether what I had done was right. As you say, in the moment, we instinctively thought it was probably right, but, nothing like putting it through the deep analysis to really figure that out. Dara Kearney, thank you so much.
Thank you, David. And actually, one final point while I think of it, one thing I didn't say on the flop is when it's very close between two options in a tournament where ICM is a factor, we often want to take the option which puts the least amount of chips into the pot. And that's another argument for calling. And similarly, in spots where we are considering betting, we often want to maximize fold equity. So we want to put all the chips in rather than make some sort of half-ass bluff. That's actually two adjustments you should make in these spots where ICM is kind of a thing in tournaments.
I can't help but feel you have managed to shoehorn in a discreet advertisement for your excellent book, Endgame Poker Strategy there, which obviously deals with a lot of ICM. Well played, well played.
Thank you, David.